Today I'm addressing a few questions that have come up regarding how psychodynamic psychotherapy improves quality of life and relationships. Unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all answer because treatment effectiveness depends on the individual issues and characteristics. In prior videos, I explored various treatment approaches. Just to name a few, if someone is overwhelmed with thoughts and feelings, I spoke about transforming persecutory thoughts into productive thinking. I talked about, in terms of depression, how we work what's called a punitive superego or a malignant introject. And I've also, for people who are overwhelmed with anxiety, discussed how we work with what's commonly referred to as an ego supportive approach. Now, when thinking about how psychodynamic psychotherapy improves quality of life in relationships, there is one particular approach that comes to mind. Let's consider someone who's struggling to maintain intimate and genuine connections. This individual may be struggling with issues around trust, managing their own aggression, that's containing their aggression, feeling constantly criticized or judged, or they have a belief in the inherent danger of others. In the past, we used to think that if we made something unconscious conscious, in turn that would lead to symptom relief, symptom being anxiety, depression, issues with trust, etc. We quickly discovered that just by telling somebody something that they're not aware of, what actually happens is the symptoms persist unchanged. And I think some of you could probably relate to this, especially if you ever, I'm just making this up, told a significant other in your life that you have control issues because you were never able to control your alcoholic mother. You may have discovered that that doesn't get you very far. So here's what I'm suggesting. If you get very upset about, let's say, the way that a loved one speaks to you, most likely you are experiencing, and it gets represented as, anger, sometimes even rage. Now, oftentimes, this anger is something that you are already carrying within yourself. Let's say, hypothetically, in your early upbringing, there was an important caregiver who was quite critical or judging of you. Oftentimes, when one is carrying around feelings of anger or resentment, the next step is that they project this feeling onto others. What does that actually look like? The way it looks is there's a constant feeling that somebody is judging, critical, or just overall that they're upset and angry with you. Now, there may or may not be any awareness of your own anger, but hold on, you may now argue, my loved one really is judgmental and critical, or my mother really does talk down to me. Look, let's just stay with this hypothetical situation from childhood, that you had this critical caregiver. Now, what happens is when someone in these early stages of development who's very critical or judgmental or abusive in any way, you can't speak up for yourself. You're too young and you depend on them. So in essence, what ends up happening is you, in my field, the field of psychoanalysis, what we call this is you introject this. In other words, you internalize this. You take it into yourself, which means then you carry it forth. You bring it with you to adulthood. So today, unlike when you were a child, if a loved one is perceived or experienced, I put emphasis on those two words, as critical or condescending or hurtful in any way, you are not going to behave like you did when you were a younger child. In other words, this triggers an even more aggressive response. This is the counter-aggression. Hence, the old adage, the best defense is a strong offense. So, in a productive or very valuable psychotherapy process, we assess for this. We assess to see if there's what we call a projection, introjection cycle that's occurring, and that leads to these conflicts of everyday life. In short, what this means is one is carrying around some past resentment or anger. This gets projected into the environment. There's an experience, that's what I said earlier, that you perceive that someone is treating you in a harsh way. This gets introjected, in other words, internalized, right? That you take this in. And since you're taking this in, this is the vicious cycle. The projective, introjective, vicious cycle is then you need to get it out, right? So then it's projected again. And in essence, what happens is there's like a feeling of being punched, then there's a counter punch, and things escalate, and unfortunately, nothing ever changes. However, once we recognize this vicious cycle, now there's hope. For someone to change, we must first work through these old feelings. But before we could work through or process old feelings, we first need to identify and then label these feelings. Now you gain insight into how past thoughts, feelings, and emotions contribute today to your quality of life and your relationships. Next, we need to give these feelings a home. Once we give them a home, this facilitates a process where we move from that vicious cycle that I mentioned earlier to a more productive, healthy cycle. But I'll say much more about this in the next video, so please stay tuned. If you can, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next video on how we give these feelings a home and we put this whole vicious, projective, introjective cycle to a rest. Okay, bye for now.